who's in charge here? Who's running the show? You might be asking yourself at different times wherever you are. When things start to fall apart, you might wonder, is anyone really in control? Is anyone really in charge, be able to take control? Or are things always spinning out of control? That's really, I think, the question that gets asked again and again in the books 1st and 2nd Samuel. Who's in charge? Who was really control of Israel? We last were in 1 Samuel back in 2021. We finished up we finished up in 2022 in January, so it's been 2 years since last we finished it. So for some of you, this might be 1 Samuel, might be a distant memory. And for some of you, you have joined us since then and feel like we're just jumping right in the middle. See, 1st and 2nd Samuel originally was really just one book, so in so many ways, we're really jumping in the middle of a story here. So let me set the stage and again ask that question, who is ruling things? The book of 1 Samuel begins in a time where Israel was a federation of different tribes ruled by these judges. And from time to time, Israel would turn back to idolatry and flee from God. And in time, as Samuel rose up, the name of this book, Samuel, the last judge of Israel, rose up and he did great things, but the people did not want him to be running the show. They wanted a king. They wanted a king like the other nations. And the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel show that rise, that change from judges into the monarchy of Israel. Really, the main kings we see in 1st and 2nd Samuel are King Saul and King David. 1 Samuel is about the rise of Saul. He does things well at first. He has success. He has success with his son, Jonathan, as well. But eventually, he wants to carve things out his own way. He doesn't want God to be in charge and telling him what to do. He is commanded to kill King Amalek, the king of the Amalekites, and he does not. He holds it back for his own wealth. And because of that rejection, that failure to kill the king of the Amalekites, he's rejected as king by God. God appoints a new king, David, the son of Jesse. David shows through his fervent seeking of God. He proclaims the power of God as God defeats Goliath through David. David fears the Lord, but also still honors the one God has put in place, Saul. He honors the king. Even though the king is seeking his life, King Saul tries to kill him twice, and 2 times David has the chance to kill Saul, and he does not, because Saul is the Lord's anointed, the one chosen by God. So Saul's chasing David. David and the son of Saul, Jonathan, are deep, dear friends. They've made a covenant together. Jonathan has protected David from his father. And then at the end of 1 Samuel, King Saul's killed. His life ends. And the theme we are going to see again and again. So this question remains, who's in charge here? If King Saul is dead, who's in charge now? The point of 1 Sam and 2 Samuel is not about whether King Saul's in charge or King David is in charge. The point of the theme that we're going to come back to is that despite sinful and wicked human rulers, Yahweh is king. Despite sinful and wicked human rulers, Yahweh is king. And that is the theme we're going to come back to again and again. So our text for today is the full first chapter of 2 Samuel. You can follow along with me in the words on the screen there as we read 2 Samuel chapter 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David returned 2 days in Ziklag. And on the 3rd day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp, with his clothes torn, dirt on his head. And he came to David, and he fell to the ground and paid homage. And David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" The young man who told him said, "Well, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. And there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots of the horsemen were close upon him. And he looked behind me, he saw me, and he called me, and I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered, 'I am an Amalekite, who said to me, "Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers." So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, "Where do you come from?" And he answered, "I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite." David said to him, "How is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" David called one of the young men and said, "Go, execute him." They struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, 'I have killed the Lord's anointed.'" David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son. And he said, "It should be taught to the people of Judah, behold, is written in the book of Joshua." And he said, "Your glory, O Lord, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled, shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back. The sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Your daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothe you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant you've been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. This is the word of the Lord. The first, and I believe the last time I heard a sermon on this text was the 1st of May in 2011. Maybe that date doesn't jump significantly to your mind right away. And for that morning, it hadn't jumped to my mind to be any significant date in my life or in history either. I listened as my father preached on not taking the joy in the downfall of your enemies. It was a good sermon, and one I still remember pieces of to this day. And as I was reviewing it this last week, parts of it coming back, but oddly enough, it isn't exactly fully the words of the sermon that stuck out to me most, but the context in which I heard this text preached. Because it was later that evening on May 1st, 2011, that we turned on the TV and switched to the news to watch the President Barack Obama stride to the podium and announce to the nation and to the world that United States Navy SEALs had located and killed Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the attacks on September 11th, just 10 years before that. How the mighty have fallen, I had thought. How the mighty have at last fallen. What perfect words to see the enemy of America finally killed. But why I remember that date and this text is because David's words, how the mighty have fallen, are not said with that kind of victory. They aren't said with scorn. They aren't said with joy. Those are not words of gloating over your enemy. How the mighty have fallen are said with throat-sobbing tears. Honest and genuine grief. Sincere and heartfelt over the loss of human life. I felt that time, finally seeing an enemy destroyed and killed, the cognitive dissonance of having just heard this text, of not exulting over defeated foes. It seems odd, right? How are we then to respond to the triumph over one's enemies? I think that is a different question. The triumphs and the justice executed on sinners who have rebelled and done damage. I think there's ways we can be thankful for God being just. But I think that's different from gloating over and grasping for our power and our victory in a self-serving kind of way. And I think we can still be thankful for God's justice and lament over the loss of life. I think these are the two things we see here. In the Amalekite, we see someone who's gloating, grasping on for power. And in David, we see someone who truly laments the loss of life. And why we have these two different things, I want us to see by the end of the sermon that because we have a mighty Messiah, that Jesus, the anointed one, Jesus, the Messiah, because he is mighty, we can honestly lament the death of both our loved ones and our enemies. Let's see, at first, I think the more easy response, the response we'd prefer, of gloating, of being victorious over those who have been defeated. This Amalekite walks onto the scene. Now, again, this Amalekite, he is a sojourner, he says, son of a sojourner, kind of a resident alien for Israel. He's made his home here in Israel, and he is here as he has walked through the camps of the Israelites and found Saul leaning upon his spear, gravely wounded. And he accounts to David what happened. He claims he killed Saul in verse 10. After Saul asks, "I'm mortally wounded, please finish me off. I stood beside him and killed him because I was sure he could not live after he had fallen. He couldn't survive his wounds. I took the crown that was on his head, the armlet that was on his arm, and here I've brought them to you, my Lord," is what he says to David. Again, the Amalekite, who is it? Why does it matter? We know him by where he's come from. The Amalekite kind of gives this poetic ending to the story of Saul. The Amalekites have been kind of a thorn in the side of Israel all the way back from Exodus. And God had commanded Saul to finish them off, to kill King Amalek, and Saul did not. Why? Well, because he thought he could get a little bit more tribute, a little bit more money, a little bit more goats as well out of keeping this man alive. So he kept him alive, disobeyed the Lord. He held his hand back from killing King Amalek. And now what is happening? There's an Amalekite who's bragging that he has extended his hand to King Saul and ended his life. That is what this man has claimed. But, again, it was about 2 years ago when we read 1 Samuel 31, if you were here. But if you flip back over, you might start to wonder, wait, is this actually what happened? It kind of is a little bit of a different story than what we see in 1 Samuel 31. It says in 1 Samuel 31 that, verse 4:31, he asked his armor bearer, "Draw your sword, thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But the armor bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword, fell upon it. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. So, no account of this Amalekite coming and finishing him off. What's the case here? Could the Amalekite really have come as an added detail? Well, David seems to believe every word the Amalekite says. But perhaps we don't have to believe that the Amalekite is a reliable narrator, as it were. Why would he lie? What gain could this man have for lying about it? You can even see it the way he's talking to David, right? He says, "I've brought this crown. I've brought this armband to you, my Lord." He's saying, I'm bestowing upon you, I'm throwing these things at your feet, the new king. And remember, I'm the one who brought them to you, who finished off King Saul. The Amalekite knows exactly who he's talking to. At least he thinks he knows David well enough. He's going to find out he's gravely mistaken. He comes and says, "King Saul is dead, long live King David." And by the way, Your Majesty, when you're putting together your cabinet, when you're, putting together your advisors, just think for a second as you're writing out that short list of names. Think about how nicely the gold on that armband glitters in the light. Recall for a moment, if you will, Your Majesty, how nicely that crown sits on your head, and just, remember who put it there? By the way, my tunic is a 42R, if you're wondering what gifts to give me here. He's grasping for power. He's seen an opportunity here to elevate himself. And it doesn't matter whether the truth is there or not. He could have scavenged over the corpse of the king. What matters most is he is here before the new king, the new anointed of the Lord. But he is instead, as David says, you're testifying to your own disrespect, your own scorn against the Lord's anointed. He has seen an opportunity for his own gain. And David, that's why he asks him where you're from. He says, I'm the son of a sojourner and Amalekite. As someone who has lived in Israel, who has become a bit more, he's almost a resident alien is what that would mean, being the son of a sojourner. It means he's also liable to the punishments of Israel. It means he should know better of how to treat the Lord's anointed, the king. And because he has done it, he has brought blood upon his own head. Remember, this guy thinks he knows who he's talking to, right? But he doesn't know David. David, who twice had the opportunity to kill Saul. And why did David not kill Saul? He's the Lord's anointed. How can I extend my hand and do any harm to him? And yet this guy comes and brags and gloats of, hey, look who I killed. Look at the trophies I have for you. Off with his head comes. Because he thought by gloating victoriously over killing the Lord's anointed, he could get more power. And yet David mournfully has him executed. The Amalekite sees an opportunity in the death of Paul for power, for pride. He sees great joy in the harm of Saul. What this describes is the wonderful German word of Schadenfreude. If you guys are familiar with the word Schadenfreude, it literally just means harm joy. It's joy in the harm of other people. That kind of feeling of seeing someone's downfall, who's your enemy, whom you have scorned for, who you just can't wait for the other shoe to drop and feel like, at last. And you have that smile on your face. Schadenfreude. Perfect word to describe a very unique feeling. And I got to tell you, our culture, there's a thriving market of that emotion. I feel like so much of the internet relies on filling you in with Schadenfreude. The joy in seeing someone's downfall. As people talk a lot about people being called out, people being canceled. What is, I think, more interesting on what people get canceled for is more to see the response of people just doing victory laps around and be like, oh, I always knew. I never liked them. I always knew there's something underneath this person. And there's just a joy and a power you get from this. When that politician you cannot stand is finally caught in their hypocrisy and exposed for their inconsistency and their lies, it's so great to revel in. The worst we see the kind of Schadenfreude drug high kick into our country is when old people in black robes die. When Supreme Court justices die, we see the joy of death in our country. I can remember sitting in a Chipotle in 2016, and there was a woman right next to me who was on her phone, and all of a sudden while looking at her phone, she jumps up, throws her arms in the air, and yells, yes! And I looked at my phone, and a notification came through of the news saying that Justice Antonin Scalia had passed away. He was, if you don't recall or aren't familiar, he was a justice appointed by a Republican president, had a very traditional, very originalist, very conservative, unyielding view of the reading of the Constitution. Because of that, you can then understand he was an enemy of progressives. If anyone's wanting a more updated, more progressive reading of the Constitution, he was the opposite end of what people wanted. And on top of that, this happened while Obama, a Democrat president, was in the White House, so progressives saw an opportunity for it. We can get our power in then. with this person dying. And you know what? The same exact thing happened in 2020 when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. Other side of the reading of the constitutional spectrum. Also, she was highly praised by her progressive reading of the Constitution, and Trump, a Republican president, was in the White House. Again, this person has died, so now we can give power. It happened. Both sides, there's schadenfreudig joy at the death of these people with families and loved ones. But what I find most interesting as I think about that, you have Scalia and RBG, two people on the opposite sides of the constitutional spectrum. Ginsburg, who was alive during Scalia's death, how did she respond? A heartfelt lament for the loss of her dear friend and colleague. And I think it still shocks people today to know that Scalia and Ginsburg were dear friends. She didn't see the court as a place of political power and influence, but she saw the loss of a human, her friend. She wrote, "For over the years at the D.C. Circuit, we were best buddies. We disagreed now and then, a lot. We disagreed now and then, but when I wrote for the court and received a dissent, the opinion ultimately released the notably better than my initial circulation." He would send his dissent to her ahead of time and be like, "Hey, Ruth, here's all the ways you're wrong, by the way," and it would help her to draft even better. They were promoting the best in each other, even though they strongly disagreed. And I can imagine that if she had died before him, he would have given the same kind of eulogy of the mourning of a loss of human life. I think that place, the Supreme Court, where I think as it is the greatest expression of the political divide, that we rejoice at the death of humans with families and loved ones. That when we rejoice, then we see that gloating, that lust for power and influence. And instead, I think we need to examine what David's response is here. A man who didn't just have a different political philosophy. Yeah, I think Saul had different political philosophies, let's say it that way, than David. But he also straight up tried to murder David a few times. And yet, how does David respond? With deep, earnest lament. He commands this lament to be learned to all the people of Judah, written down. He wants this to be sung and resung and memorialized for all to hear. It's a challenging lament. Oddly, without any mention of God, no real kind of theological statement in it. What are we to take away from it? There's no real kind of theological triumph that a lot of the Psalms have, but what we do see in this song is the same mind, the same poetic genius that wrote the Psalms, David. He says in the beginning, "Your glory, O Lord, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen." That is the theme of this psalm, this lament. How the mighty have fallen. Again, it's not gloating of how they have been restored to the dust they are. It is you who are lovely and mighty and powerful and respected and admired. You're gone. That is the tone there. They have fallen on the high places. They've fallen in the midst of battle. The weapons of war have perished, he says. The weapons of war, talking about Jonathan and Saul. He forbids those in Gath, those in Ashkelon, the place of the Philistines, their enemies. He's like, don't even let them know. I don't want to even see the propaganda that is put out in Philistia, rejoicing over the loss of Saul and Jonathan, these beautiful, amazing humans that were loved by God and yet fell. He mourns the anointed one. The anointed one in Hebrew is Mashiach, Messiah. That's what Messiah means, the anointed one. And he mourns the death of Saul, whose shield was no longer anointed with oil but defiled, anointed with blood instead of the oil it deserved, the shine and sheen it deserved to have, is emblematic of the defilement and the loss of Saul. He can barely get to the name Saul. He says the name, the mighty, the shield of the mighty before he can get to Saul. He can barely get the name out of his mouth. And he celebrates what Jonathan and Saul have done. He celebrates almost as if they're still alive. He talks about the sword not going back empty, as if the sword has not returned to its scabbard before it's tasted blood. The bow of Jonathan not turned back. And the name of this song becomes The Bow, in reference to Jonathan's great bow. Calls them beloved and lovely, admired by the people. This is a stirring, a powerful tribute. It is personal and yet public for everyone. He wants all of Israel to share in this grief collectively and powerfully. And yet he shares that personal grief over his dear friend and brother Jonathan. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. My very pleasant you've been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. Again, this is the Jonathan who they made this covenant together. This promise of friendship. Even so that Jonathan would not betray him to his father Saul, but continuously protected him on and on again. And now this man is gone. A lot of modern readers, I imagine some of you, as you read that, as he says, your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. I had a lot of people read this and conclude that this relationship must have been erotic and sexual between David and Jonathan. And I think to our modern reading, that makes a lot of sense. But it doesn't make any sense in the original context. And I just want to speak to that because if we only read through our modern lens and only stick there, we actually miss the deep and the rich beauty that is Saul and Jonathan's relationship. Because, and this is somewhat connected to what I said when we were in 1 Samuel 20 and talks about that covenant. Because when we conclude that deep, powerful, extraordinary love between two humans must be erotic and sexual, I think we're really cheapening love and what the bond and covenant love can be. That yes, between a husband and a wife, there is beautiful sexuality and eroticism, but between others, there can also be love that even surpasses that. Yes, we can imagine even greater love than that. That is not romantic. That is not sexual. And that is what we see with David and Jonathan. You see, in that time, people would not say, my wife or my husband is my best friend. I think we've evolved in that way, in a good way. Good friendships between husbands and wives. I think that's very important. But that was not the case in a lot of these arranged marriages and such. There wasn't that unity of interest and passions and joys in the world. And so Jonathan and David shared a deeper kind of bond on a different level. And also, I want to say, just as well, if this is such a public lament, I doubt that David would be broadcasting his sexual exploits with Jonathan if that were the case. Instead, I think this should encourage us how we should think about love and relationships with others who aren't our spouses. I think that should challenge us a little to not see as if erotic and sexual love is the highest form there is. But in Christian love and covenantal love with our brothers and sisters, yeah, there is love that can surpass even what our culture says the greatest form of love. As one commentator wrote, the more we love, the deeper we grieve. I think that's what we see David doing here. David says, sorrow is hardest where love is deepest. That's what we see. We see a deep, deep love of someone who is gone. Let that guide us in how we think about grief. I know we struggle with sorrow. We don't even use that many words for it. We use depression, we use sorrow or sadness. We'll use grief. But how many words are used in here? It's talking about him weeping, him grieving, his lamenting. Now that's a word we do not use, lament or lamentation. It's loud, it's public, it's for all to see, it's for all to hear, and it's for all to share in. That's something we don't do. Something the Bible does. I think something we should learn from. And as we're moving away from the desire to gloat and take pride in the death and loss of life of others, but to lament together, to grieve together when life is destroyed. I think there's something that David proves about himself, actually. He is mourning the loss of the anointed one. And by doing so, I think he's proving his honor and his worthiness to be the anointed one. He is showing first that before his head is publicly anointed with oil, he first anoints his cheeks with tears over the loss of King Saul. He rightly mourns the tragedy, rightly honors the fallen anointed one, the fallen Mashiach, the fallen Messiah. He's kingly in his lamentation. David rightly honors him and shows his true heart. And includes Saul, his enemy, in this. The man, if you read through Psalms, you'll come across a few Psalms and I'm like, oh, he wrote this while Saul was trying to kill him. The Psalm 89, which was our call to worship, I picked that psalm because in the first half of that psalm, it's written while he is being chased by Saul. And he wants God to get between him and his enemies. And yet now that God has brought judgment upon Saul, David's not happy. He's not gloating. He's not smirking smugly to himself. He's in mourning. Even Saul has indeed been cruel and awful. He respects. Saul's an image bearer. He's created in the image of God. He's chosen by God to reign and rule over God's people and did so sinfully. And I think David sees what we need to see in the loss of human life. That when those who were once mighty are slain on the high places as a result even of their own sin, we can look at that high place covered in blood and say, there but the grace of God, I go. There, save but for the grace of God, go I. David knows that this mighty one who has fallen is like, even if I consider myself mighty, I will fall in that same way too. Even if I am anointed as king, even though I have been privately, when I am publicly anointed, I may fall. And we're going to see in 2 Samuel how horrifically David falls in sin. We see in the loss of life, even the loss of sinful human people, our equality with them as sinners. So that even when our enemies fall, we can be thankful that their sin is put to an end, but we can mourn that that person in God's image has been destroyed. We must remember who our enemy is, not the body and soul human there. To remember our enemy is sin. And that sin has done horrific work in that person's life and through that person, through that villain. Yes, Osama bin Laden did great evil through sin reigning in him. And it's mournful and lamentable what he did. It's evil what sin had done through him. It was awful. And yet what tragedy as well, that he could not see the salvation of the Lord. How tragic. How awful too. That sounds really hard to hold both together. And I got to tell you, I can tell you about this today. I don't do that well. It's holding these two things in my mind, and I often don't know how to reconcile to them. The only way I can is to see my own sin, and not to think I'm so mighty to conquer it on my own strength or my own honorableness, but only by the grace of Jesus Christ, the true Messiah, the only one who was mighty to actually defeat the enemy of sin. The only one who I think enables us to lament, but lament with hope. Jesus Christ allows you to lament with hope because death itself, reached out its hand to strike the Lord's anointed, Jesus the Messiah. Death struck the Messiah when we should have been struck. Death destroyed Jesus when we should have been destroyed by it. And yet, we do not lament that without hope. We lament with hope. Because Jesus fell so that we would not, and Jesus rose so that we would rise again in the high places for him. We were risen over the grave. He rose over the grave so that we would be mighty in his strength. That is how we can lament today. Lament when lives are destroyed without tasting or knowing the grace of Jesus Christ. Be thankful that there is judgment for sin, but to hope and proclaim that there is good news in Christ being struck by sin and death and yet striking back victoriously to put an end to it. And Christians, believers, this is what we celebrate here. This is what we taste and see. This is what our lament points us to. The Lord's table. How do we reconcile, how to lament and not gloat? How to thank God for justice over sin and yet mourn when lives cannot be saved? How can you possibly do that? By the grace that is ours, the grace that is shown to us at the Lord's table. This table is for those who professed faith, who've come through the marks of baptism, who've become members of the Church of Jesus Christ. You don't have to be a member here, but have been received as a member at a gospel-proclaiming church. And so we gather as believers to witness to what Christ has done. And so, as the words of Paul says, on the night when Jesus was betrayed, he, after giving thanks, he took bread and broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you." After supper, he took the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for remission of sins. Drink from it, all of you." So as often as you drink this cup and you eat this bread, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. And so let each of you examine yourselves as worthy partakers by the grace of Jesus Christ, lest anyone comes unworthily and eats and drinks the Lord's judgment upon themselves. So the ushers will dismiss you row by row. If you'd like to come forward, you may. If you've not been a baptized member, you can still come forward. You can cross your arms over yourself. I'd love to pray over you. I'll do that for any children who've not been received as members as yet. I invite you all come here and witness to the Lord's grace to us. Let us pray. Our Father, would you use these means of grace to teach us, to show us, to speak to us who your Son is, what he has done. Feed us in our hearts by faith, we pray. Amen.